British Columbia holds some of the most expensive real estate on the planet. A modest bungalow in Vancouver can cost more than $2 million, and the whole world knows it. What the world does not know is that a few hundred kilometers inland, in the same province, there are houses you can buy for less than the price of a used pickup truck. Whole homes, with yards and mountain views, listed for under $100,000, some for $40,000 or $50,000, and still they sit unsold, month after month, year after year. These are not ruins. They are ordinary houses in ordinary towns that the modern economy has quietly walked away from. If a family can own a home outright for the cost of a car, why is nobody rushing in to take the deal? Hit subscribe. I promise this is worth your time. Number 7. The Cariboo. The high-rolling gold country of the central interior, spread along the old wagon road that runs north from Cache Creek toward Quesnel and Prince George. This was where the Great Gold Rush began, and its ghosts are everywhere. The town of Barkerville, once said to be the largest settlement north of San Francisco and west of Chicago, is now a preserved historic site where nobody truly lives. Just down the road, the little town of Wells, built later around a hard rock gold mine that closed in the 1960s, hangs on with a few hundred residents at an elevation where the snow piles deep and the winter runs long, and here you can still find a house for well under $100,000. Across the wider Cariboo, in places like Likely and Horsefly, and the smaller settlements around 100 Mile House, the economy leaned on gold first and then on the forest, and the forest has been faltering. The rolling plateau is beautiful in the low gold light of a summer evening, the cattle ranches and the lodgepole pine stretching to the horizon, but drive it in the aftermath of the wildfire seasons that scorch this region, and you pass blackened hillsides, closed mills, and for sale signs standing in the tall grass of yards no one has mown. The houses are cheap because the work that filled them has thinned to almost nothing, and because the fires keep coming back. In Wells, on a January morning, the wood smoke hangs low over the false front heritage buildings, and the snowbanks climb past the windows, and the nearest full grocery store and hospital are an hour of icy highway away in Quesnel. A hearty few hundred people hold the town together with tourism and art and sheer stubbornness, but drive the back roads of the Cariboo, and you pass more empty cabins than occupied ones, more collapsing barns than working farms, the paint blistered, and the roofs sagging under the weight of 100 winters. The gold that started it all is long gone from the creeks, and the forest that replaced it as the region's living is now a tinderbox of dead pine that burns hotter and closer every summer. A Cariboo house listed for $60,000 or $70,000 is not a bargain so much as a measure of how far the economy has quietly stepped away from the place. Number 6. The Bulkley Nechako and the Lakes District. The vast forested plateau of the central north strung along the highway between Prince George and the coast. This is timber and mining country, and it has been bleeding jobs for 2 decades. The village of Granizal, out on the shore of Babine Lake, was built from nothing in 1965 to serve 2 open-pit copper mines, and it grew into a tidy community with schools and services. When both mines closed in 1992, the reason for Granizal vanished, and its population, once well over 2,000, has fallen to only a few hundred people. Houses there are among the cheapest in the province, some changing hands for the price of a good used car. Nearby, the town of Fraser Lake lived and died with the enormous Endako molybdenum mine, one of the largest of its kind in the country, which curtailed its operations in 2015 and took hundreds of jobs with it. Burns Lake, Houston, and Fort St. James, all across this belt, have watched sawmill after sawmill fall silent, some of them in sudden, wrenching closures that erased a town's largest employer overnight. The story of the mill closures here is a story of sudden shocks. When a sawmill announces it is shutting for good, it does not take 50 jobs. It takes the economic spine of the entire town in a single afternoon, along with the contractors who hauled the logs, the mechanics who fixed the trucks, and the shops that survived on the workers' wages. Burns Lake watched its largest mill explode and burn in 2012, killing 2 workers and throwing hundreds out of work at a stroke. Houston lost its sawmill in 2024, ending more than half a century of cutting and taking with it the reason many families had ever come. Fort St. James, on the shore of its beautiful long lake, has ridden the same brutal cycle of open and close for decades. Drive through on a winter afternoon and the main streets are quiet, the mill yards empty of trucks, the light fading early behind the spruce, the temperature settling toward -25, and the real estate listings tell the story in numbers. Solid 3-bedroom family homes with big yards, listed for $80,000, for $60,000, for less than the down payment on a condominium in Vancouver, waiting for buyers who do not come. Grand Isle, out on its lake, is quieter still, a village built for thousands now holding a few hundred mostly older residents, where a Lakeview house can be had for the kind of money that would not buy a parking space on the coast, and where the emptiness of the streets tells you exactly why. Number 5. The Peace Coal Frontier, in the far northeast where the Rocky Mountains give way to the foothills, a hard, cold country of long winters and enormous distances. The town of Tumbler Ridge is the clearest lesson this province has to offer about the boom and bust life of a resource town. It did not grow up slowly. It was designed and built all at once, incorporated in 1981, purely to house the workers of 2 huge new coal mines, and at its peak, it held nearly 4,800 people in brand new streets, carved out of the wilderness. When the largest mine closed in the year 2000, the bottom fell out. The mining company bought back almost every house in town, and for a while homes in Tumbler Ridge sold for as little as a few $1,000s, some of the cheapest real estate anywhere in Canada, an entire modern town going for the price of a car each. The population crashed. The town very nearly folded entirely. What happened next in Tumbler Ridge is the rare hopeful chapter in this story, and we will come back to it, because it is one of the few places that found a way to climb back from the edge. The wider Peace Country tells the harsher version. This is a land of enormous horizons and brutal cold, where the winter clamps down for half the year and the wind comes off the foothills with nothing to stop it, where the temperature can sit below -30 for a week without lifting. Chetwynd and the smaller settlements scattered along the highways live and die by coal, gas, and timber, all of them industries that boom and bust on prices set thousands of kilometers away, and when the cycle turns down, the for sale signs multiply and the prices fall through the floor. The scenery is vast and beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, the cracked highways running straight to the horizon past frozen sloughs and stands of dead pine, but a cheap house in this country comes with a heating bill that could frighten anyone who grew up on the coast, and with a distance to the nearest city, Prince George, of several hours over a winter road that drifts shut in a bad storm. Number 4. The far northwest and the Stickine, the wildest and most isolated corner of the province, a country of ice fields and canyons, where the roads are few and the towns are separated by hundreds of empty kilometers. This is where you find Cassiar, once a thriving asbestos mining town of about 1,500 people, with schools and a hospital and a swimming pool, closed down completely in 1992, when the world turned against asbestos, its buildings auctioned off and trucked away, or bulldozed and burned until almost nothing remained but foundations, a lonely ore tram line on the mountainside, and the memory carried by former residents who still call it the best place they ever lived. Farther down toward the coast sits Stewart, at the head of a long fjord on the Alaska border, once a booming mining port that held thousands of people during the gold and copper rushes of the last century, and now shelters only a few hundred, ringed by glaciers and buried under some of the heaviest snowfalls of any inhabited place in Canada. In these northern reaches, a house can be astonishingly cheap, because the nearest city with a hospital and a proper grocery store might be 400 or 500 kilometers of mountain highway away, a drive that in winter becomes a genuine expedition. In Stewart, the snow can pile more than 10 meters deep across a winter, burying the lower floors of houses, and the town survives on a thin trickle of tourism, a little mining, and the traffic through its port, a shadow of the roaring boomtown it once was. Along the highway that threads this corner of the province, the settlements are tiny and far apart. A gas pump and a handful of houses at Dease Lake, an old Hudson's Bay post at Telegraph Creek down a hair-raising road, the country in between utterly empty of people and full of grizzly bears, caribou, and mountains that have never been named. A house here might cost almost nothing, but there is a reason for that price. The scenery is staggering, the silence total, and the isolation absolute, in a way that no photograph can convey. The nearest hospital, the nearest large grocery store, the nearest hardware store with the part you need, all of it lies a full day's drive away over mountain passes, and in winter, that drive becomes a genuine gamble against the weather. The cheap house here comes attached to the end of the world. Subscribe to show that these videos actually matter and make a difference. Number 3. The Fraser Canyon, the steep, dry gorge where the Great River cuts south through the mountains, and where the highway and 2 railways thread together along the canyon walls. The towns here were built on the railways and the river, on gold and salmon and the movement of freight, and they have been fading for decades as the trains stopped needing crews and the canyon traffic learned to pass straight through. This is the region that produced the most shocking image of all. The village of Lytton, perched where the Thompson River meets the Fraser, holds the record for the hottest temperature ever recorded in Canada, 49.6 degrees, set on the 29th of June 2021, during a heat dome that settled over the province like a lid. The very next day, the entire village burned to the ground in minutes as a wildfire swept through, destroying almost every building and killing 2 people. Years later, Lytton is still struggling to rebuild, tangled in the slow, expensive work of clearing the ash and laying new foundations, its handful of returning residents living among empty lots where a town used to be. Up and down the canyon, in Spence's Bridge and Boston Bar, and the smaller settlements, the houses are cheap, the summers are scorching, the wildfire risk is severe, and the old reasons the towns existed have mostly drifted away downriver. These were railway towns, built when the great transcontinental lines needed section crews and division points every few kilometers to keep the trains running, and when the railways modernized and the crews shrank to almost nothing, the towns that fed them lost their purpose. Boston Bar and its neighbor North Bend faced each other across the river as busy railway communities for generations, and both have dwindled to a fraction of their old size. The canyon is a place of ferocious beauty, the brown river roaring far below the highway, the dry pine hills rising steep and gold on either side. But it is also a corridor of real danger, its towns squeezed between the wildfire on the slopes above and the flash floods and washouts that tear at the valley bottom. A house in the canyon can be had cheaply, and every buyer should understand that the same dry heat that makes the summers glorious is the heat that put the record of 49.6 degrees on the map and burned Lytton to ash the following afternoon. Number 2. The Kootenay Silver Belt in the mountainous southeast, where the steep valleys of the Slocan and the surrounding ranges once held some of the richest silver and lead mines on the continent. In the 1890s, this country boomed so hard that a town like Sandon, deep in a narrow gulch, grew to thousands of people almost overnight, with electric lights, competing newspapers, and dozens of hotels and saloons. When the ore played out and the mines closed one by one through the early 20th century, the silver towns collapsed just as fast, and Sandon today is home to only a small handful of caretakers among the ruins and the restored buildings, one of the most complete ghost towns in the country. The larger surviving villages of the Slocan, places like New Denver, Silverton, and Caslow, on their beautiful mountain lakes, hung on at a fraction of their old size, and they remain some of the quietest and most affordable corners of southern British Columbia, where an old miner's cottage can still be had for a price that would buy nothing at all on the coast. Walk the quiet streets of New Denver on a still autumn morning, the mist lifting off Slocan Lake and the sharp peaks of the Valhalla Range mirrored in the water, and you are in one of the most beautiful and most forgotten corners of the province, a place where grand old buildings from the silver boom stand along streets that see almost no traffic. These towns found a second, quieter life, as havens for retirees, artists, and people seeking a slower existence far from the coast, which has kept them alive where the pure mining towns died. Yet even here, the population is thin and graying, and the young still leave for the cities. The mountains are gorgeous, the lakes clear and cold, but the mines are a century gone, and the work never truly came back. And a cottage in the Slocan that would be a $2 million lakefront trophy on the coast can still be bought here for a fraction of that, precisely because there is so little to do for a living once you arrive. Number 1. The Central and North Coast, the drowned, rain-soaked country of fjords and islands, where the only roads are the sea lanes and the towns cling to the water at the foot of the mountains. Here sits Ocean Falls, a pulp mill town of some 3,500 people at its height, shut down in 1980 when the mill closed for good, now home to a few dozen year-round residents, rattling around the moldering shell of a much larger place, reachable only by boat or float plane. Down the coast, old cannery and fishing settlements like Namu stand abandoned and collapsing into the inlet, and Port Edward, near Prince Rupert, watched the great North Pacific cannery that once employed hundreds fall silent as the fishery declined. On this coast, the emptiness is wrapped in rain, 4 meters of it and more falling in a year, and the forest and the moss move in fast on anything the people stop maintaining. A house here might be cheap, if you can find one for sale at all, but there is no road to it. The ferry comes rarely, and everything you need must arrive by boat across some of the roughest water on the coast. Bella Coola, at the end of its long fjord, is joined to the interior only by a single terrifying gravel road that drops off the plateau down a wall of switchbacks known as the Hill, and beyond it, the villages of the Central Coast float in a green world of rain and mountain and sea, with no land route to anywhere. The people who remain are tough and self-reliant, growing food, fishing, and helping one another through the long gray winters. But theirs is not a life a newcomer can buy into, cheaply, because the true price is measured in isolation, in the days when the weather closes the water and the sky, and nothing moves in or out at all. The cheap coastal house is beautiful beyond words on a clear summer evening, the light gold on the inlet, and the eagles wheeling overhead, and it is a very different proposition in the black, streaming dark of a January storm, when the nearest doctor is a boat ride and a bush flight away. To understand the cheap houses of the British Columbia interior, you have to understand that this province was built, away from its coast, almost entirely on the extraction of resources, and that the towns of the interior and the north were never really towns in the way a city is a town. They were work camps that grew roofs and schools. The mountains of British Columbia are stuffed with metal, blanketed in timber, and threaded with the rivers that once ran thick with salmon, and for a century and a half, people poured inland to pull that wealth out of the ground and the forest. Gold first, in the great caribou rush of the 1860s, when tens of thousands of men climbed into the mountains, chasing the richest placer strikes on the continent. Silver and lead and zinc in the Kootenays, copper and molybdenum across the Central Plateau, coal in the Peace and the Elk Valley, and above all, timber, the endless green ocean of lodgepole pine and spruce and fir that fed the sawmills and pulp mills of 100 interior towns and made forestry, for generations, the beating heart of the provincial economy. Every one of those industries carried people into the valleys, and then, in its own time, let them fall. The reckoning came from several directions at once, and it came harder here than almost anywhere. The forest industry, which employed whole regions, was hollowed out by a brutal combination of forces. Automation meant that a modern sawmill could cut far more lumber with a fraction of the workers, so even the mills that survived shed hundreds of jobs. The mountain pine beetle, an insect no bigger than a grain of rice, exploded across the interior through the 2000s as the winters grew too mild to kill it off, and it chewed through an area of forest larger than many countries. Roughly 18 million hectares of pine turned red and gray and dead, gutting the long-term timber supply. The endless softwood lumber dispute with the United States piled tariffs onto every board shipped south. Mills that had run for 50 years began to close, one after another, and each closure took the economic ground out from under the town wrapped around it. The mines followed the same arc. A body of ore is a finite thing, and when the copper or the molybdenum or the asbestos runs thin, or when its price collapses on a market set on the far side of the world, the company closes the pit and moves on, and the town it built has no second act. Layer onto all of this, the newest and most frightening force of all, the wildfires, which have grown from a summer nuisance into an annual catastrophe as the climate warms and the dead beetle-killed forests turn to tinder. The record fire seasons of recent years have burned more than 1 million hectares at a stretch, filled the interior skies with smoke for months, and driven tens of thousands of people from their homes, and in one appalling afternoon an entire town was wiped from the map. Each of these blows sent people the same direction, out of the interior and down to the coast, to the lower mainland, to Kelowna, to Victoria, to the cities where the jobs and the hospitals and the future had gone. The young left first, chasing university and work and a wider world, and once enough of them had gone, the decline began to feed on itself. A family weighing whether to stay looks around at who has already left. When the mill closes, the mechanic and the grocer and the school teacher follow the workers out the door. When the school drops below a handful of children, the last young families give up and go too, and the town they leave behind grows older, smaller, and cheaper with every passing year. The great irony of British Columbia is that it suffers, at the same moment, from the least affordable housing in the country on the coast, and some of the cheapest in the country a day's drive inland. And the gap between those two worlds is the story of where the work went and where the people followed. In this province, a house is cheap for exactly the same reason the town around it is dying, and the two facts can never be separated. Which brings us to the question at the center of all of this. If a house in the interior or the north of British Columbia can be bought for under $100,000, and in some towns for a small fraction of that, why does almost nobody take the deal? The province is desperate for affordable housing. Hundreds of thousands of people are priced out of the cities, and yet these cheap houses sit empty. The answer is that the low price on the listing was never the true cost of living there. Consider the work, or rather the absence of it. The house is cheap precisely because the mill closed or the mine shut down, which means there is no job waiting when you arrive. A family cannot eat a low mortgage. Without work within reach, the cheap house is not a home but a trap, and the nearest real employment might be a 2-hour drive away over a mountain pass. Consider the winter, which in the northern and mountain interior is long and severe, with the cold holding below -25 degrees for weeks, and the snow piling meters deep in places like Stewart and Wells. Heating an old, poorly insulated house through a winter like that burns thousands of dollars in fuel every year, and in the remote towns that fuel and everything else must be trucked hundreds of kilometers, arriving with a freight charge attached to every item. Consider the services that have quietly vanished. When a town shrinks, the hospital downgrades to a clinic and then closes. The school consolidates into a district an hour away. The grocery store shuts, and the family that bought the cheap house finds themselves driving vast distances for the ordinary business of life. For a doctor, a dentist, a hardware store, a carton of milk. Consider the wildfires, which have made whole regions of the interior a genuine hazard to live in, and which have begun to make insurance difficult and expensive to obtain, when a company will write a policy at all for a wooden house at the edge of a forest that burns most summers. Consider the maintenance. A cheap old house in a harsh climate is a cheap old house that needs a new roof, a new furnace, new pipes, and there is often no contractor within 100 kilometers willing to make the drive, and no hardware store to supply the parts. Consider the internet, thin or absent across much of the interior and the coast, which strangles any hope of earning a city income from a rural porch. Consider even the simple business of buying and selling the house at all, because a home that sits on the market for 2 or 3 years with no offers is a home that ties up whatever money you sank into it, and the same emptiness that let you buy cheap will trap you when the day comes to leave. There is one more thing the price tag hides, and it is the sheer scale of British Columbia itself. The province is bigger than most countries, larger than France and Germany combined, and its emptiness is not the flat emptiness of the prairie, but the vertical, tangled emptiness of mountain after mountain. A cheap house in the north is not an hour from a city. It is 400, 500, 600 kilometers of 2-lane highway from anything resembling a full-service town, a road that winds over passes that close in blizzards and wash out in the spring melt. Between the settlements there is nothing to fall back on, no next town a short drive over, only the forest and the rock and the long climbing road. A person who buys the cheap house is not moving to a quiet community. They are moving to an island in an ocean of mountains, and every single thing that town cannot provide must be hauled across that ocean at their own cost and their own risk. Beneath all of the arithmetic lies the heaviest weight of all, the psychology of moving to a place that everyone else has already decided to leave. There is a particular ache to a main street where half the shop fronts are papered over, to a mill yard standing empty behind a locked gate, to a school with only a dozen children left in it and a rumor that it will close next year. A house is cheap because the community that gave it meaning has drained away down the highway to the coast, and no amount of money can conjure that community back into being. The buyer is not only purchasing a building, they are purchasing the isolation, the distance, the closed mill, the burning summers, and the slow, quiet knowledge of being one of the last people in a place the rest of the province has moved on from. Can these communities recover, or will they simply keep emptying until the lights go out? The honest answer is that a few of them might, and most of them probably will not. Tumbler Ridge is the proof that a turnaround is possible. After nearly folding when its coal mine closed, it clawed its way back as coal prices recovered, new mines opened, and geologists discovered dinosaur footprints and bones in the surrounding hills, turning a dying mining town into a fossil destination with a global geopark designation and a population that has climbed back toward 2,400. Rising metal prices have breathed new life into a handful of mining districts, and the newest hunger of all, the world's demand for the copper and other metals needed for the green transition, is sending companies back into the mountains that built these towns. The trouble is that the way mining works has changed, and the change does not help the empty towns. A modern mine no longer needs a town wrapped around it. It flies its workers in from Kelowna or Prince George for 2-week rotations and flies them home again, housing them in a camp of trailers beside the site, generating a fortune and a few hundred paychecks without ever creating a single new family, a single new school, or a single house that needs buying in the nearest struggling village. The wealth still flows out of the interior. The people no longer have to live there to earn it. This is why a cheap house in a mining region can stay cheap and stay empty even while a billion-dollar mine roars away an hour up the road, because the mine does not need the town, and the town has nothing else to offer. Provincial and federal programs have tried to fight the tide. There are immigration streams designed to steer newcomers towards smaller communities that need workers, offering a faster path to settle in return for filling a job in a struggling region. There are efforts to lure remote workers north and inland with the promise of a paid-off house and a life among the mountains for the price of a city parking spot. In some regions, it is the First Nations, whose roots in these valleys run thousands of years deep, and whose communities are often younger and growing, where the old resource towns are shrinking, who increasingly hold the economic future of the land through their rights, their businesses, and their share of new projects. A small trickle of people have come on the strength of all this, fallen in love with the clean air and the space and the mountains, and genuinely made it work. They remain a trickle. Most newcomers who arrive chasing a bargain house discover the second winter and the closed clinic and the 400-kilometer drive to the specialist and the fact that there is simply no work, and within a year or two they pack up and drive back toward the coast, and the house goes up for sale again at the same low price. Drive the interior highways of British Columbia at the end of a long summer day, and you feel the size and the silence of the province settle over you. The light turns gold and thick across the dead gray stands of beetle-killed pine. The shadows of the mountains reach all the way across the valley, and the smoke of a distant fire hazes the far ridges. A shuttered sawmill stands behind its chain-link fence, where a whole town once clocked in for the morning shift, the log yard empty, the conveyor rusting, the sign at the gate faded to nothing. A neat little house sits empty at the edge of a village with a sign in the yard, and a price on it that would seem impossible on the coast. The lawn gone to seed, the curtains still hanging in the windows, waiting for a family that keeps not coming. The wind moves down a main street past the papered windows and the closed cafe, the way it has moved for 20 or 40 or 100 years, and somewhere a last streetlight flickers on over a road that no longer leads to work. This is a province that gave the world its gold and its silver, its copper and its coal, and more timber than almost anywhere on earth, and asked in return only that someone might stay in the valleys and remember. The houses are cheap because the memory is all that is left, and the mountains, in the end, do not care whether anyone stays to watch the light go down behind them. Look after yourselves out there, wherever you are watching from, and spare a thought, tonight, for the empty towns of British Columbia, going quietly dark in the shadow of the peaks that made them, and then let them go.